Here I'll show you how to very quickly search multiple workbooks in Excel using VBA and macros. So it'll work something like this, where we have an input box here. Let's say we want to search for records for Jim. Instead of using the ID field, let's use name. Hit the search button, and what it just did right there is it went to another Excel workbook on the computer, searched, and returned all of these results. So we have about 70 results returned. And this will probably be the fastest way that you can search multiple workbooks in Excel. Now, if you haven't seen the previous tutorial for quickly searching an entire workbook in Excel, please go ahead and view that, because I am not going to cover what I covered in there. The main search feature, the thing that does all the heavy lifting, is not going to be covered in this tutorial. I'm not going to show you how to make any of this interface. I'm going to assume that you know all of that and that you watched that tutorial. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to TeachExcel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials. This is going to follow pretty much the same format as the other tutorials, the fast searchable lists or search an entire workbook in Excel tutorial, where when we open up the workbook, pretty much I've got the same format on the tabs, just a bunch of raw data with our ID and name columns over here. And then I added a workbook and a sheet column so that we can very easily see where the data came from, just to verify that everything is working. And here what I've got in the first two test workbooks, just 100 rows of data in the first two sheets. Test 2 is a repeat of test 1, and test 3 is the big boy, where we have quite a bit of data. So here I only have one worksheet, so we can make sure it works if it just has one worksheet. And just about 100,000 rows of data here. So this is just to show you how much data you can search through. So now that very long explanation's out of the way, let's jump right into the code. What we have up here, I modified it a little bit, and I'll cover that in a moment, but we have the macro from the previous tutorial for quickly searching through an entire workbook. And I spent quite a long time explaining all of this, so I'm not going to explain any of it today. If you want to learn how this works, go ahead and watch that tutorial. Highly recommend it. But this is where our fast search is going to come from. So all that we're going to do here is we're going to take this, make a few modifications I'll talk about in a moment. Here's our clear data macro. And we're going to essentially encapsulate it with this search separate workbooks macro that will go through the directories and pull in all the references to the workbooks, and then we use the other one to do all the searching. So I'm going to start here, and let's talk about how this works. So at the very top, we declare a few variables. File name doesn't really matter because it's just a string, not a big deal. But the two important ones here, we declare a workbook master. This is where our data will be displayed. So if I hit Alt F11, this is our workbook master, because this dashboard right here is our master worksheet in our master workbook. And this is our workbook slave. So the slave is going to be the reference to the workbooks that we want to search through. And we tell Excel that these variables are going to be workbook variables. That allows us to store the reference to the workbook, and it makes our life much easier. Now, in the previous tutorial, I told you that application.screen updating was not important. However, in this case, it is very important, because what our macro is going to do is it's going to open up every workbook in the directory, search through it, and then close it. And if you show the user that, they might kind of freak out. So what we do is we do application.screen updating equals false. That means that you are not going to see Excel change at all. Nothing in the interface is going to change until you finish the macro and go down here and turn screen updating back on. Application.screen updating equals true. So make sure at the very end of the macro that you turn that back on. Very important, or it'll really confuse you when you can't figure out why Excel is not working the way it should. So make sure we turn this on at the end of the macro, and we turn it off at the beginning of this macro. And also, if you edited your copy of the data search macro and you adjusted it up here, you see I still have it commented out. We can leave it commented out here. It doesn't hurt anything. And just work on it in our new macro, search separate workbooks. Okay, so we've made it so it'll run faster. It's going to make life much better. Now we want to tell the macro what our master workbook is. So we had our variable, WB master. We have to put set in front of it because this variable is going to hold an object. So set WB master equals, and we use this lovely word active workbook. Active workbook tells the macro that we want to deal with the workbook from which we're calling this macro. Now here, just like in last week, we want to clear the data before we put any new data in it. So I go ahead and call clear data. If you want to call another macro, you simply type call and then the name of the macro. Technically, you don't have to type call, but it's good practice and it'll help us when we want to add some arguments to it later on, just to make things a little bit more clear. So you type call, then clear data. Now this goes up here and it runs our clear data macro, which I believe was not at all changed from last week. Should be exactly the same. It runs on our dashboard worksheet in the current workbook and clears the data. So far we're just setting things up. Now here's where things start to change a little bit. There are many different ways to do this to get a file from a directory. This one I'm going to show you a little bit more versatile, although perhaps a little bit more verbose than you require. So I'm going to show you how you can do it where it'll easily work with a single workbook or every workbook in an entire directory. And to do that, we first need to set a directory to search. So just create a variable, call it whatever you want, and then we type the file path on the computer. So hard drive C, colon, backslash, and then the directory, and then backslash. So we're just making a directory reference right here. Now we want to search a single workbook. So what we need to do is we need to figure out what workbook to search through. So we have our directory to search, and then we need to type in the name of the workbook through which we want to search. Now to combine a variable and text, we use this plus sign. So it's essentially like concatenation. Basically, what we're doing is we're adding this and this together to create a full and complete file path. So it tells the macro how to get to the file. So variable name plus, and then within quotation marks, the name including the file extension. Now I have this inside of the dir, the directory function. And this is what's going to make it so easy for us to go through the directory. So what we do, we have this function, and then we set a variable equal to that file name. And down here, I'll cover the directory part when we search through a directory. Now down here, we use file name to loop through the files in the directory. And since we're only dealing with one file, technically we don't need to put it inside of a loop, but I wanted to make it as easy as possible for you to change this from working with one file versus every file or multiple files from a directory. So we put it in a loop. So we have the file name, then we do a do while loop. So the do while loop basically says run the loop while some condition. And this right here is the condition. The condition is get the file name variable, figure out how long it is the length. This is like using the len function within Excel. So if you know that, you can figure out how many characters are in a cell. Same thing. How many characters are in this? Basically, it just says, is there a file name? If there's a file name, it'll be larger than 1 character long. It'll have more than 1 character in it. So if the file name variable has more than 1 character in it, more than 0, then we're dealing with a file. So let's do something with a file. So now we go down here. We are in our lovely loop, and this is where the big stuff happens. What we're going to do here is we're going to open the workbook. We're going to search through the workbook, get the data, copy paste it, and we're going to close the workbook. So open, search, close. Here we open. Here we search. Here we close. Easy peasy. So what do? We use our workbook slave variable that we created above. We set the workbook slave variable equal to the workbook we want to go through. Remember, file name, that's the reference to a workbook. We found the workbook, okie dokie, great. Now we do workbooks to reference a workbook. We open the workbook, .open, and we tell it what workbook to open. So we do that by using the directory to search, so the location of the workbook, and then the file name of the workbook. Now, if you're dealing with a single workbook, These steps are a little bit redundant. You don't have to really loop through this. You don't have to have all these variables and blah, blah, blah. You could just put the full file path right here. So you could skip some of those steps. But let's keep this modular, make it easy to expand later. So now we have a reference to the workbook, and the workbook is open. But we turn screen updating off, so we are not going to see the workbook open. It's open, and it's contained in this variable right here. That's how you can think of it. So all we have to do anything with this workbook is now reference this slave variable that we created, WB slave. That's now our open workbook. So to figure out anything about that workbook, just type WB slave down here, and you can do whatever you want with it. So once we do WB slave, period, you're going to see all the things that we can do with a workbook. Now what we do, I'll cover this more in a moment, this part, but what we do is we call our data search macro that we made in the last tutorial for quickly searching through a workbook. And we have to pass 2 arguments to it this time. We have to tell it what workbook is our master workbook, where we want to put the data, and we have to tell it what is the slave workbook. What workbook are we searching through? Now before explaining that, let's move on to the last part. Once we have copied all of our data, we close the workbook. So remember how to reference the workbook. We type WB slave, and whatever you want to do with it, just type a period and you'll get a list. Here we want to do close. So it's very simple. What do you want to do? Reference the slave workbook. What do you want to do to it? Close it. And this is very important. Save changes, colon, equals false. Sometimes you'll just see, it could be WB slave dot close, and then you'll just see false here. You won't see the save changes. So technically you don't need to type it out like this, but I think it's a little bit easier to understand when you type out the argument. So there's 2 different ways to write your arguments in VBA, and this is one of them. So we want to make it so that saving changes does not occur. So we set that equal to false. That's very important to do because even though we opened up the workbook programmatically, there are ways that the workbook data could have changed. We could have messed something up in this macro here and accidentally changed something there. There are a lot of different things that could have happened. And we don't want to save any of those changes. We just want to open the workbook, get the data, close it. So now that we've closed it, here we have something very, very important. At the end of our loop, do not forget this. Type file name equals dir. If you don't do this, I put it right here, you will enter a never-ending loop and you'll have to close Excel. A hard close. It's not going to be pleasant and you can lose a lot of data. Now at the end of that, type loop. Once we're out of the loop, remember to turn screen updating back on, and that's all there is to it. It's as simple as that. Now let me go ahead and explain the changes that we made here and how this funky little thing works. So here we call the macro data search, which is this macro up here, the macro we created in our last tutorial, data search, and we pass it 2 arguments. So here, WB master and WB slave. Now these arguments, let's go back up here, are listed within the parentheses up here. Usually, our macro looks like that, and you may have wondered what those parentheses are for. The parentheses are for argument listing. And what you do, you type in the variable name of the argument. So this right here is how I'm going to reference this argument within this macro. This right here is what the argument is, what the variable is. It is a workbook. So this is set to the same type as, when we go down here, WB master as workbook. They have to be the same type. Same thing for WB slave. It is a workbook. Notice that you don't have to put dim here, but this right here is the same as doing this right here. So the same thing is just declaring it, but if we put a dim here, go down, you'll see that it is an error, so you don't need dim. Now, once you have entered these arguments up here like this, you have your variable names. You need to go down to where you call the macro, and then you can put in the 2 arguments. Now we have passed data to the data search macro. We've passed our WB slave reference, so the workbook reference, the reference to the workbook that we're going to search through, and we've passed the reference to the workbook where the data should go. Now, this macro can use that. So it knows where it is, and it knows where it's searching through. And that's how we're able to use this macro with very few modifications to search through these separate workbooks, almost exactly the same way as we searched through the entire workbook in the last tutorial. Let's scroll down the macro and let's look at the changes. Very important. This is our dashboard sheet. It says where our dashboard is, so we know where to put the data. Before it was just Sheets Dashboard. Now we put WB Master in front of it, so WB Master dot Sheets. So now it has the full reference to the location. Inside the dashboard is saved WB Master dot Sheets Dashboard. And this, if we go down here, WB Master, this is getting a little bit confusing, but bear with me. WB Master, we set to Active Workbook. Now you can set it to whatever you want to reference any workbook that you want. So if you wanted to, we could do Workbooks, and then you can see here you can do a workbook index, or you can do a name, workbook name. Oops. WB Master equals Active Workbook. So just so you can follow that, WB Master equals Active Workbook. We pass WB Master over here. We set WB Master right here. So Active Workbook dot Sheets Dashboard. Now it's important that we set Active Workbook before we opened any other workbooks and started doing stuff with them. Now going down through the data, I did change this a little bit because I added 2 columns to the data that we're going to search through. I added the workbook and the sheets column, so this I believe was 13 previously, it's now 15 because we have 15 columns of data. It used to go to column M, now it goes to column O because we added these 2 columns. Now let's scroll down. We don't have to update search value or field value because we updated the dashboard variable already. Here you want to kill clear data. I left it in here, but I commented it out, so I use a single quotation mark, and that's why it's green now. It's not going to run because we're going to run this macro multiple times for every workbook. It's going to search through workbook 1, then when it goes to search through workbook 2, it's going to clear the data that we saved from workbook 1. And we don't want that. We want to have all the data listed. So now let's scroll down. One of the next things that we have to do, very important, is to go through all the worksheets in our slave workbooks. So previously, this was just for each WS in worksheets, and worksheets references every worksheet in the current workbook. This time we want to tell it to go to the worksheets in the slave. So we do WB slave dot worksheets. That's all. We're just saying, hey man, do this in this workbook. Okay? Now down here, so now that we have WS, remember we can reference the current worksheet using WS down here, and we told it not to search the dashboard worksheet because we don't want it to search through here, especially if we have data listed down here. It can really cause problems. But if you want to search through every worksheet in the other workbook, the external one, go ahead and change this or delete it. Do whatever you want with it. You can add more here, or you can remove this if statement check. I showed you how to do that in the previous tutorial. And now the only other thing that had to be changed here, scroll down to the very end of this macro almost. I left in the old reference. What I had to do is previously, these references here, they did not have a dashboard variable in front of them. So it didn't say specifically where it should check for this. I went ahead and added that. Now I should have had that in there previously, but I forgot because it didn't matter in that case. So what I did is I added dashboard in front of cells. So you can see it right here. It doesn't have it, and here it does. And then we scroll over here. Where are we? You can see cells without anything in front of it and cells with a dashboard in front of it. So all we're doing is we're just saying, make sure you do this in the dashboard, which is in the master workbook. And this is what's nice when you don't hard code things. When you have a macro like this with variables like the dashboard variable, it makes it easy to update it and adjust it so you can do things like transition from searching through the current workbook to searching through external workbooks. So once you've made those changes, everything is nice and happy. There's only one more thing you have to do in the workbook, and that is right-click the search button, go to Assign Macro, and update it so that it works now with Search Separate Workbooks of that macro instead of the other one, which you shouldn't see here anymore. So change that reference, and then we are good to go. Now here, let's go ahead and do it again through test 1. If I search for Jim, name field, bam, and it's that fast. So all that code I just explained was just executed. Excel just opened the workbook test1.xlsx, searched through every worksheet in it, and spit out the data. We can see it went through workbook 1. We can see it was in sheet 1. And then down here, we can see it was in sheet 2. So a quick little way to validate that our data is okay is click up here, go to Data, Filter. We can click the drop-down arrow, see that it was in 1, so that's the only one there. It'll show you all the possible values that are entered in the column. For sheet, we can see sheets 1 and 2. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and go through an entire directory. So all you have to do to change this to go through an entire directory, comment out this line. So now we're in the new macro, by the way, search separate workbooks. We go down to file name, comment this line out for searching single workbook, and uncomment this line for searching the entire directory. And all we did here was we replaced the reference for a single file name to a reference for the Excel file extension. So we're able to use wildcard characters with this function. It's a beautiful function. Trust me, there are many dirty ways to do this. This makes it so much easier to go through directories. So with this simple function, we put the extension of the file, and then we put a little star right here on each side. So you get to that on a US keyboard by hitting Shift 8. It's the multiplication sign, basically. And that means that it's going to find every file that's an Excel file in at least the 2007 and later format. You can change this to be whatever you want. You could even put XL if you wanted to make sure you went through all the Excel files. For the old versions and the macros and all the different types of Excel files, you can change this to whatever you want. But here, it's going to go through specifically Excel files in the 2007 later format that do not have macros. We could also put in a file name or part of a file name, so it only goes to those file names in the directory. So now let's go back real quick. Let's see how many files we have here. What do we have? 70, I think. Yeah, so 82 starts at row 10. Perfect. Let's hit search again. Should take a little longer this time. We can see the loading button. Now, let's go all the way to the bottom. What do we get? 36,499. So we searched through 3 workbooks and returned over 36,000 results in mere seconds. I tell you, there are many, many ways to do this, and I'm pretty sure that all of them are worse than this. I can't believe how many results we were able to return so quickly on my crappy little laptop. And once again, we can change here, ID, search. It's going to do the exact same thing. It's just amazing. Now we have over 9,000 results, searching by the ID number. So each name will have multiple ID numbers, and that's just because of how this data set's set up. It doesn't really matter. It's not a big deal. Now there are a couple other ways that you may want to search through directories or search through specific files, and that could be where you click this button here and a dialog box pops up and you select a directory, or you select multiple files or a single file from a specific directory. But I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial. This tutorial is long enough, and I'll cover that in the next tutorial. For this one, you just go here and adjust the line that begins with file name, and that's it. This one to search the entire directory, this one to search a single workbook, and make sure that you update directory to search to work with your computer, starting with the drive letter and then the full file path, including this last little slash at the end. And if you haven't already, make sure you go ahead and download this file so that you don't have to type out all the code by hand, and watch the previous tutorial so that you can figure out how this search macro works. It's pretty powerful, but you may need to make some changes for your data so that you can fit it all in here and so that everything works exactly the way that you want it to work. So it's pretty helpful to watch that. But for this tutorial, that's all there is, and I hope you found it helpful. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.